Welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are just so excited today to have the continuing series of the Judgment of Paris. You can find Wine Talks on Spotify, Google Play, Apple Play, iTunes, and your favorite podcast hangouts, and always sponsored by the Original Wine of the Month Club, now sporting the Bordeaux series, Napa series, and the Sweet Wine series. I'm excited. I'm not sure where to start, but I just want to introduce Violet Gergich, and she is the daughter of the famed Mike Gergich, who was responsible for the wine that beat the Burgundies in the Judgment of Paris. And I just wanted to touch on that, what the Judgment of Paris was, in case some of the listeners don't know. This is a tasting that occurred in 1976. It was not meant to be much, but it pitted the French Burgundies, the white Burgundies, Chardonnay, versus 4 or 5 California Chardonnays, and it pitted California Cabernets against the French Bordeaux. And it wasn't meant to be much. We won. It's probably the only book you'll ever read where you know the ending, but it's a fabulous story. And part of that story is the Gergich family. And I have here today Violet Gergich. Welcome to the show. This is going to be so much fun.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
And I see in the back we have a cutout, which I still say it looks like he's standing there looking out the window. It's your father.
It absolutely is. It's not a recent one. I think it was taken when he was in his 60s or 70s, but it's a great picture of him actually standing in his Yonville vineyard surrounded by mustard. And we made a standee just for fun. It was for an auction lot, and then brought it back to our tasting room. And it was so popular, it was stolen. So then we actually had to make some more.
Stolen, and now it's in the living room in Napa. And, he's wearing his famed monikered, was that a fisherman's hat?
It's a French beret, actually.
French
My dad
beret.
how did he know when he was in college, studying, when he bought the beret? He actually bought the beret because he lost his umbrella. He left it on a tram going to university, and he couldn't afford an umbrella. So he happened to see this French beret in a window shop and thought, well, not only will it keep my head covered, but I can put it in my pocket so I don't lose it. And years later, he's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm wearing a French beret. And then I beat the French in 76. And so it's a lovely coincidence.
It all ties together, and it became sort of his moniker for the industry. Well, let's do that, because my family they're all immigrants. My grandfather's an immigrant. My mom's born in Chicago. I guess that's not an immigrant, but my father came from Cairo in 1949, and your father was Croatian.
Correct.
This is the part that fascinated me about the part in the book about your father's history and how he got here. Just tell me, as a child, what he was doing, and then how he ended up deciding to go to the University for Enology, and how that trek started.
So he was born in a small, poor village in Croatia, and they literally produced everything that they consumed. They had no money. They bartered for things. My dad actually grew up stomping grapes and drinking wine. So most Mediterranean folk drink wine, whether it's a combination with water or by itself, from a very, very young age. And so that not only makes you feel very happy, but it's a lot easier doing all the work you need to do to stay alive. So his father was known as the best vintner in the village. Not that they would call themselves vintners, he just made the best wine. But my dad wanted to do something practical. He was the first person in his family to go beyond the 8th grade. And he ended up studying business. And after he got a job working in an office, and a whole year later, he looked and he thought, what have I accomplished this year? And he saw that he had a cabinet full of papers. And he thought, this is not very exciting. I can't get passionate about, if I retire with 70 cabinets full of papers, what does that tell me about my life? So he thought about what gave him great joy and passion, which was wine. And so he went back to school to study viticulture and enology. And Croatia was part of Yugoslavia at the time. And the Yugoslavians said horrible things about America and what a terrible place it was and awful it was. One of his professors went to on sabbatical to UC Berkeley, which was very close by. And after a year, when he came back, the students, my dad wanted to know, what was it like? What's America really like? And the one thing that he remembers that he said was that Napa Valley is paradise. And so he thought, well, why should I die and wait to go to paradise when I can just go to America and go to Napa Valley? So he really decided to find his quest for freedom. He believed America was a land where he could achieve his dreams. And so that's where he set his mind on reaching Napa Valley. And he did in 1958. And he worked with Lee Stewart of Sovereign Cellars, who also trained Warren Winiarski, as well as with Brother Timothy at Christian Brothers. And then he had the longest stint with Andrei Chelichev at Blue Vineyards. And Andrei was known as the Dean of California winemaking. He literally brought not just science, but also the art of winemaking back to Napa after it had really been decimated after Prohibition. And spending all those years helping him make that George de Latour Private Reserve Cabernet fascinated Robert Mondavi, who was starting his own winery. And Robert actually thought that Napa Valley had the climate, the soil to someday be, produce wines maybe almost as great as the French. And he hired my dad because he wanted all that knowledge from Andrei Chelichev. And my father actually made his 1969 Cabernet that put him on the map, as well as his cash flow wine, which was the Fumé Blanc, which is one of the reasons we still produce a Fumé Blanc.
69 Georges Latour?
The 69 Robert Mondavi Cabernet.
Oh, Mondavi, right. After
yeah, so that was the wine that made Robert Mondavi famous. And that was actually why the owners of Chateau Montelena wanted to hire my father. One of them, Lee Pashich, had actually been having his grapes custom crushed at Robert Mondavi. And he'd met my dad and thought, this guy can really help us make our dream, which is to make some of the best Cabernet in the world. So that's how come he became part of Chateau Montelena.
Well, this is you want to write through that whole history. We're gonna go back.
We can always go back to it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We're gonna go back to the University of Zagreb, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that where he went?
Yes, no. University of Zagreb. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And this is a known university for enology.
Yes.
At the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if University of Bordeaux is around and the other French schools, but how many universities in Croatia or Yugoslavia at that time could there even been? And the kind of education you get from there was good enough, I guess, because I wouldn't know, to come to America and say, hey, I've got this education in this field, and just decide to pick up and go. And this is the part that intrigues me, not only of your father and other immigrants, is like, who has the guts, there's other words for that term, but who has the guts to say, I'm going to take off and go see what's there. And you find this passion in your father, and this entrepreneurial skill is just fearless when it comes to these stories. Are these the stories we heard around dinner table?
Absolutely. No, right? This is, he's so full of passion, and when he sets his mind on something, he absolutely accomplishes it. When he left Yugoslavia, he actually fled. He went on a United Nations visa. It was the first year they were actually offering these visas for students to go to different countries to study for the summer and then come back. Well, my dad left planning not to come back. So he had literally collected $32 American. He had a cobbler sewed inside his shoe, his sole of his shoe, and fled and worked at a farm for several years, waiting to get a visa to America. And actually was in a camp one time. He went to seek political asylum, and they just threw him in a camp. And the owner of the farm went to look for him in Nuremberg and found him and was able to bring him back. But he heard that Canada was actually looking for lumberjacks. So he decided, well, it's close to America, so why not? I'm going to try anything.
Sure.
And so he came there, and apparently his train that showed up in Vancouver was late, and the person who was supposed to take him to the Yukon never showed up. So he went to the Vancouver Boys College. He had a connection through his nephew, who was a Catholic priest.
Wow.
And he had said, if you get into trouble, call them up. So he shows up on their doorstep at midnight. And the next morning, they offer him a job as a dishwasher. So he's like, lumberjack, dishwasher. I'll do the dishwasher.
Sure.
And so he ended up staying there for a while and eventually ended up working at a paper mill as a waiter or a busser, I think, until they discovered that he had, degrees in science. And so he actually became a chemist and worked analyzing a lot of the paper products that they had. And then he's like, you know what? I need to get to America. Let me put an ad in the Wine Institute and see if somebody will hire me. And
the Wine Institute we know today?
I'm sorry?
The Wine Institute that we know of today, was it the same?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow.
And it's really fun because several years ago when we were celebrating 40th anniversary of the Judgment of Paris, and we were doing that in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian Institute, And they have a lot of my dad's papers that he donated there. And my dad was like looking for, he said, Violet, can you go through my papers and see what's there? I have no idea what's there. And so I spent literally a day poring over all the papers. I found his original UN visa that left him,
Wow.
where he went to Germany. And I found the ad, a copy of the ad that he actually had placed in the Wine Institute. I thought, that is so cool. I have it right here.
What
So
beautiful archives
yeah,
to tell the story. So,
absolutely.
so does he, when he tells these stories at dinner time when you were kids, was there, you know, was the passion was obviously in the story. Was it a lesson time? Was it just, this is what I've been through? Or was it something about, you know, take the risk when it's time to take the risk? Because there's so $32 in the sole of your shoe and take off with just a couple of contacts, and, you know, to go be a lumberjack but end up a dishwasher, and then they find out that you have science skills, is kind of, what are the odds, right?
Exactly, exactly.
So
Right. I think, you know, besides having that will and passion, he did happen to be at the right place at the right time where people acknowledge what he could possibly do. But he worked for it. You know, when he was at the paper mill, he said the other, you know, the other workers would take time off and they would all play bocce ball. And he actually, you know, his priceless possessions were his textbooks that he brought. He had his paper cardboard suitcase full of textbooks. And while the other guys were playing bocce ball, he would pull out his textbooks and study them
Wow.
so that he wouldn't forget everything that he learned, so that when he got to America, he would be prepared for his job. So it wasn't really any accident. And in fact, what he always talks about was that he tried to learn as much as he possibly could from everyone that he came in contact with. And from everyone, he learned something different. And all of this education got absorbed into him, so that when it came time for him to really, you know, be under the gun and perform, he was able to do so. And he started at Chateau Montelena. He was hired on May 8th, I believe, of 1972. And they were planning on crushing the vintage, you know, September of 72. There was no winery. There was a shell. He literally had to design and build a winery prior to crush, so that there would actually be a home for the grapes that he could make into wine.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah, but
Yep.
he, as he said, it's all that experience that he had, that he learned from so many different people, that he was able to do that. Plus that passion.
Well, I told George, Mr. Tabor, I don't call him George, we're not that close, Mr. Tabor. I said, he says it's luck that I showed up at the tasting that day. And I said, I don't really believe in luck. I go, it's really, luck is preparation meets opportunity. The opportunities come when they come, but if you're not prepared for something, you can't take advantage of it. And that's what luck is. And it sounds like your father had dreams of the idea. Was it always to start a winery? It was just to learn the craft, and certainly it couldn't have been looking for ratings, since we didn't have ratings then. So was it just to learn the craft and become the best that he could be?
I think he was always trying to be the best that he could be. So when he was 10 years old, he left the village he grew up in to go study, because there was no further education there. And his father, who had no money, said, son, I have nothing to give you, but I will tell you something that I hope you take to heart and keep your entire life, which is to every day do your best, learn something new, and make a friend. And if you do those things, you will always be successful. And so if you think about that, you know, I heard this growing up. I got a little tired of it, frankly, but the older I got, the more I appreciated it. And now I keep telling all of my employees, again, these are our values. If you do this, whether it's in your business life or your personal life, you can succeed. You know, every day, do your best, learn something new, and make a friend. So
I think we get so wound up in minutia, particularly in these crazy days of COVID and the things that, I mean, it's gotten so much more complicated just to run a business right now. Yeah. But you get so caught up in the minutia, and there's such a simple formula. It really is, because to be happy, it doesn't mean I've got a 95 from the Spectator. Really, it means that I have friends and I'm proud of what I do and I work hard. I mean, you can always go to sleep at night with that thought and know that you're going to be all right. The other stuff is sort of irrelevant. When I was talking to Mr. Tabor about the Judgment of Paris and him just showing up, you know, decided to show up, I said, you're trying to tell me that that if you're walking down Champs-Elysees that day and a young French woman bumped into you and said, let's go have a drink, that you wouldn't have showed up? He goes, absolutely, I wouldn't have been there. So your father lands. One of the intriguing parts of the story that is in the book is lands himself in front of a hotel, a small hotel in St. Helena, not even sure where he's at, not even sure what to do, doesn't know where he's going to sleep, has $32 sewn in his shoe, and really doesn't have a place to go. And I guess there was a light burning in the window or something. What, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I believe he ran into somebody and asked about, is there a place to stay in this town? And they said, yes, go around the corner and there's the St. Helena Hotel. And so he showed up and asked if there was room, and they said yes. And I believe it was either $1 or $2. I can't remember which one it was now, for the cost of the room. And he said, well, which room? He says, go upstairs and pick any rich room you want. And so when he woke up the next morning, he used their telephone to call Lee Stewart, and Lee Stewart came in his pickup truck to come bring him to the winery. And what was really amazing to my father was that here he is, a complete stranger. You know, he'd never seen America before. He was here in Napa Valley, his paradise that he'd been trying to get to for years. And he comes to the winery, and surrounding the winery are Zinfandel vines. And he looks at them and he goes, this is Plavac Mali. This is native to my homeland of Croatia. This is amazing. I found a friend in America. And so he asked him, you know, where do these grapes come from? And Lee said, you know, well, we're not really sure where they come from. And my dad thought, that's it. They've got to come from Croatia. So
That's so fascinating, because just to dovetail off of that, the plight of Zinfandel. I mean, how many times it was tried to be the indigenous grape, the only Vitis vinifera grape we have in America, but that's not true. You know, there was rumored that Hazarethi brought them in the 1800s. We don't know if that's true. Primitivo was supposedly part of its heritage. That's not true, because the DNA actually goes back to Croatia.
It does. And actually Primitivo is Zinfandel, but it's not the origination of Zinfandel. So if you think about this, would any Italian in their right mind call something Italian Primitivo? Of course not. It's primitive. It's from those savages across the Adriatic.
That's right.
So it came in from somewhere else. And so Carol Meredith was able to prove, with the help of two Croatian scientists who actually were at University of Zagreb, Eddie Malatic and Ivan Page, and they actually found the original Zinfandel vine. And it took a while because, you know, so the original vine is called Crljenak, which is hard for Americans to pronounce, but it had died off after phylloxera hit Croatia. And it really wasn't replanted very well because, you know, people weren't as happy with it. It got moldy when it rained, and it didn't ripen evenly, which are very characteristic of Zinfandel. Mm-hmm. Its offspring, though, was Plavac Mali. That was the one, and that was widely planted. So you think about these Croatians, they don't have the nice, you know, pristine vineyards that we do here. Okay, here's this vine, here's this vine. They just mix everything up all together. And so it took a while to find the vine, but it was proven through genetic tracing that it is the origin of Zinfandel.
You just
made my dad very happy.
You just connected huge dots for me, because I've tasted many Plavac Mali here, brought in Slovenian and other parts of that Central Europe, that I did not connect them to being Zinfandel. Mm-hmm. So that makes a ton of sense now, and I appreciate that, because I've been trying to figure out some of these. Well, when we were in Croatia, we went to the tourist side of Croatia. We were in Hvar, Dubrovnik, and Split. Mm-hmm. Beautiful, and the wines at the restaurants were gorgeous. And I'm with my friends, like, well, what's this about? I'm like, I have no idea. I can't pronounce it, and they don't grow Cabernet here. And so I relied on the somms and the waiters to choose something based on what we're eating, and was fascinated by it. Why do you think these other types of grapes that are so, well, let me preface this. I'm Armenian. There's an Armenian trade growing in Armenia. They use a grape called Areni primarily. There's another one called Sireni. They make nice wines. I don't consider them noble wines, but I thought the wines from Croatia were absolutely gorgeous, and what can I say? They're world class in their character as a grape. So how come those things haven't come to America? Why aren't we planting those things here?
Well, you know, they're not actually recognized as varietals, and we found this out because we had a vine of Crljenak, which is a long story. Ridge actually did. They ended up bringing in hundreds of Crljenak vines to UC Davis to do studies, et cetera, et cetera. They ended up with 12 vines after all of those hundreds, and they gave us one of those vines, we ended up budding it to some old Merlot that we had in our Calistoga vineyard. So when we looked at this, apparently Helena is not a registered varietal with the government. And in order to bring something in as a varietal, it has to be that. So
I see.
in other words, it has to be a fanciful name. But really what happened was during communism, there was no impetus to, and no incentive to actually produce things of quality, because it didn't matter what you did. So you may as well not put the effort out. And so that knowledge of fine winemaking, which had been through hundreds of years in Croatia, was lost. And so there was an emphasis on making cheap wines. And so that kind of attitude was what Croatia started with once it declared independence. So those aren't the kind of wines that you send out. I think a friend of mine, when I was in in college, said, "Oh, I found this wine from Croatia. Let's try it." It was a Chardonnay, and it was terrible. Like, why would I drink a Chardonnay from Croatia? It was like $3 or $4 or something like that. But
interesting.
yeah. So now I think, now that Croatia's declared independence, there's so many more vintners now who are taking these native varieties. Most of those varieties, there used to be over 500 native varieties in Croatia. And again, with phylloxera, most of those died off. There's maybe about 150 now. And those are being planted. I think that there's more interest now in working with the native varietals with fine winemaking. Because when my father came there, he established a winery in 1996. And was immediately chastised by all the local winemakers for actually putting his wine in barrels. They're like, "You crazy man, why are you putting your wine in barrique? You may as well throw it in the Adriatic, for all the good it'll do you." And so that kept up for years after years after years. And literally one summer I was being berated by all these guys for, barrique, barrique. And then the next summer I come back and I see all these bottles in the airport store, and the ones that say barrique on them are more expensive. So it was, they finally sort of caught on.
That's really funny.
Yeah.
They're using amphora before that. They're using clay pots, I think. I mean, that's still.
Oh, there's a winery now that's like brought back the amphoras. No, it's just, it's
using concrete back then.
It's marketing. So yeah,
that is
I am sure Croatia, has been there since the Greek and Roman times. We knew that the Greeks actually talked about some of the best wine being produced on the island of Vis, which is part of Croatia. And that was several hundred BC. So the history of winemaking in that area has gone on for many, many, many centuries.
That's one of the things, and we'll get back to the judgment bears here in a second, but the passion that your father has to have, the passion you have, and my passion is, I've been telling my customers, I've been doing, this is my 30th year of doing this, tasting wines every Tuesday for 30 years. But the realization of what the value of the beverage is, what wine really is, its connection to the earth and the time of place and a sense of time and place, is probably 10 years old for me. And it takes that kind of realization and passion to make things happen in this industry. And we talk about, there's lots and lots of winemakers, and some are really, really good, and there's some just aren't that great. Let's face it, there are good doctors and bad doctors, and there's good wine clubs and bad wine clubs too. But the formula, like a chef, and we're tied to the food business with my daughter's. She's a baking chef. It's about the passion. It's about how much commitment you're going to put into making the best product you can that make people feel something. Your dad must have had this when he landed in St. Helena, and to go through those risks and to put $32 in his shoe, not to take that story too far, but to show up and see, the leaves of a vine and say, "This is for my homeland." And that inspires him even more to do the best, and then to do what he ended up doing. So let's jump to Chateau Montelena. Your father made the 72. Well, we carried that wine in my dad's store. In fact, it was the wine of the month, and I'll dig up the newsletter and send it to you before the 73, obviously.
Right.
But we featured that wine as one of the wines of the month because Mr. Barrett was our neighbor. He used to come in the store and he goes, "Paul, could you please bring some wines in? I'm tired of donating stuff to everybody in Palos Verdes. So we just have them here so I can point them somewhere." So how fascinating that we had father's first wine at Montelena.
Mhm.
The story of Montelena is in the book. I want people to read about it, but it's, Mr. Barrett was an attorney and from Torrance who had friends in the construction, big developers, and Ernie Hahn, I think, was one of them. And
Right.
they he used to come in the store all the time as well. So
Mhm.
here's this tasting. Stephen Spurrier, being an Englishman in Paris, Rue Madeleine, he had his store. He was doing the Académie de Vin, and I understand it was really Patricia Gallagher's idea to maybe confront the French wines with California wines.
It was actually, and because they were trying to figure out, what is some way that we can do to actually promote this. So that whole concept of, an Englishman trying to sell wine in Paris, well, that's just plainly ridiculous.
Right.
So really trying to drum up some publicity, and Patricia had known that they'd been tasting some wines from California that they were really excited about. So she thought, well, wouldn't it be really cool to actually put some of these California wines and taste them next to the French and really introduce them to something that they've never had a chance to experience. So she'd been to California a few times, came to your store, which is great, as had Stephen. And so that idea really took off. And I think more people talk about Stephen than they do about Patricia. But I think the idea was that together they came up with something that really changed the world.
But they didn't have much place to go. I mean, I'm going to read you this first sentence in chapter 16 of the book. It says, in the summer of 1975, Patricia Gallagher was making plans to visit her sister in Palos Verdes Estates, the wealthy coastal community south of Los Angeles. And then it talks about how Mr. Spurrier got a hold of her and said, needed to get the nap and find some wines. But what was there? Like 25 wineries maybe, or 50 at the not 50, I don't think.
Not that many wineries, and they really wanted to focus on the smaller, more boutique wineries. And I mention this because when Robert Mondavi started his winery, and my father worked for him, he started out small, but he kept getting bigger and bigger. That was one of the reasons my dad felt comfortable moving to Chateau Montelena, because the idea was to produce really only a small quantity. And actually, my dad ended up hiring Zelma Long to take his place. So she was there as an intern for a while. She'd studied biology, and he saw a lot of promise in her and convinced her to come work in the wine industry. And so she took over his position there, and another strong winemaker.
And so when he tells a story about vinting the 73,
mm-hmm.
and the movie Bottle Shock talks about what they saw on Attorney Brown, all that, but he was just trying to make the best wine he could with what he had. I don't remember if those were estate grapes. Were they estate grapes at the time? Because
no. And actually, the real story. So the 72 was the very first vintage at Chateau Montelena. Right. 73 was the second. As I mentioned, my dad had to literally build a winery from the ground up. And when they were bottling the 72 vintage, there was one part that had been delayed, and the mechanic who was supposed to install that part on the bottling line was sick. But they had to bottle before crush. So that part was actually a vacuum pump that went on the corker that was responsible for removing the oxygen from the neck of the bottle. And that was the 72 vintage. So the wine had literally been protected from oxygen during fermentation, during bottling. And then with some of this oxygen, pushed into the top of it, it actually had a temporary oxidizing effect. So that was a 72 vintage, lasted for a little bit. They agreed, gosh, this tastes great. Wait a little bit, disappeared. And so that was a 72.
Wow.
So the actual premise of Bottle Shock is not correct. There's so many things there are more things that are untrue about that movie than there are that are true. And I think, most people now that have heard about the Judgment of Paris have heard about it through Bottle Shock, which is not the real story.
Sorry.
And so
a dramatization. In fact, I met
dramatization. Absolutely.
What's her name? I can't remember her name now. The producer of the show. I met her at Montelena. We kind of did this little promotion because I was giving away the video with some bottles of Montelena Chardonnay. But what was her name? Anyway, But here we are in Napa, and I think I did count at some time. I think there were 25 wineries, and these wineries, certainly we didn't have the technology, we didn't have all the know-how. We had some colleges here in America. Your father went to Zagreb. There's the University of Bordeaux and some others in France. But really, these pioneers weren't born of that age of winemaking. They were born of bootstraps. I mean, Warren Winiarski was a bootstrapper. He didn't bother with some of those things. How, and this is probably too big a question, but like, how different is it today when it comes to bringing people in to work in the winery? What are we looking for? Are we looking for the character that your father was, or are we looking for this educated biologist? How's that changed do you think, from the times of those days?
I think today, as in those days, there's a combination of things that we look for. And it depends on what kind of position are you looking for. Many people fall in love with wine and they want to come and get into the wine industry. So what do? Well, the easiest thing is to work in the tasting room, meet people, talk about wine, learn, educate yourself. But if you're actually interested in being a vintner, oftentimes you end up saying, hey, I'm going to work as an intern for Harvest for free. Let me educate myself. There is something to be had about education and having a degree in viticulture and enology, as well as chemistry. So all of these things can be very important. But what's also very important is a sense of passion and a sense of art, because wine is something that truly is an art. I'm a musician, so I'm always comparing music and wine.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very similar in that they make people happy and bring them together. They can be sometimes the most simple of things, and they can also be the most complex of things that with each revisiting you get more and more and more. And there's a time and a place for all of those. So I know the question was about getting into the wine industry. There's a lot more people these days who want to get in the wine industry than there were back in those days. But it's also a much larger industry. When I was growing up, people didn't go out to eat all the time. You went out to a fancy restaurant, which was usually French, and food was heavy, and it took you a month to recover from, the one meal that you had. People had wine for special occasions. But, growing up in Napa Valley, though, you grow up with a lot of vintners. When I went to high school, I didn't see kids drinking because they did it at home with their parents. And
That's right.
in fact, at my, Catholic high school, we had a graduation party where some of the parents brought the wines, and it was all chaperoned. And, it's a very different situation than it was these days. I guess you could say it was a little more like the Wild West, or really it was a little more like Europe, which is how I was raised as a Croatian, as a European, but in the freedom of America. For my dad, for him breaking grounds on July 4th of 1977 for Gergich Hills was one of the proudest moments of his life, because he said, this is the moment, here I am, I'm achieving my dream to become a business owner and to be in control of my own destiny and not have somebody tell me what I had to do, and yes, it's going to be hard, but, he was used to hard work, and the fact that he was able to make wines that, not just the Mondavi 69 Cabernet, but the 73 Montelena Chardonnay, these wines put people on the map. And to be able to take all that knowledge and expertise and to found his own winery in conjunction with, Austin Hills and Mary Lee Strebel of the Hills Brothers Coffee family, it was a dream come true.
You think, it's funny, here he is at 77, opening his own winery, the dream of a lifetime, like he said. There's a story in the Coronet magazine, which was the Reader's Digest of its time, I think the 50s, about my grandfather who opened a carpet store here, and he came and he took my grandmother to the hills of Hollywood and looked over the Los Angeles and told her that the streets were paved with gold here. And he came from a suppressed Turkey environment, the Ottoman Empire. So do you think there's a different perspective of what the American dream is today, or that it's still alive with immigration, proper immigration? I won't get political here, but they're coming here. People like your father, my grandfather, and my father as well, come here because of that freedom and a chance to achieve what they've achieved. Do you like telling that story, and do you get positive response when you tell that story, and do like people go, yeah, I get it now?
Mm-hmm. People absolutely do love that story. And I think that's one of the reasons my father's story resonates with so many people, that idea that you can work hard, you can, fight hard for your passion and your dream and achieve it. And, with all the problems that America has, it is still a place where people look at as, this is my dream,
That's right.
to come to America. And it often turns out to be very different than what they expected. But even with all of its flaws, there's still no place like it on earth. So,
I I don't speak very good French, but I
I don't
speak
speak French at all.
so
Too many vowels.
it's hard. But because my father spoke when he grew up in Cairo, I learned it with him, and we have a blast with it. But I do have many young women who teach French in America that came from France, and they're my teachers. And one of them, not too long ago, maybe it was 6 to 9 months ago, said that the American dream is a farce.
Mm.
She said this in English, by the way, so I would understand. So, and I said, "What do you mean?" And we got into this political conversation. Well, she recently bought her first house,
Mm-hmm.
and the attitude's changed. She now feels like she's accomplished something, and it's because of that it's because of her coming here. She works hard. She teaches French in like 3 colleges, but she's now realized what that dream actually means because it's played out for her, at least in that sense.
Right.
So in 1977, he starts Gergich Estates, and had the fame of the Judgment of Paris changed him? Did he care? Were the accolades important? What impact did it have on him as a person, and then on the winery when it got started?
Well, it's interesting because people often ask, so, what was it like once your dad won? And, how did she? I'm like, it didn't really, it just sort of, he remained the same person, but I think he actually had more confidence in the fact that all of those years of hard work and effort and learning from so many people have actually paid off. Um, so, he continued to work hard. I spent, I think from the time he was at Mondavi, when I was, this high, he was taking me to work with him. And, every weekend he would go to work. And I remember when he left Chateau Montelena, I was really sad because I was in love. I mean, here's this underground castle with a Chinese lake with these gorgeous Chinese gazebos on it. It is a kid's heaven.
Phenomenal.
And so I'm like, so we're going to this flat land where there's nothing, and we're going to build something that's stucco and plywood and concrete. That doesn't sound very appealing. But, no matter, how far he got, he never stopped. And always, literally every weekend would take me with him. And you were talking about, was it education? Was it fun? It was all wrapped together. I think when I was very young, I pretty much knew most of the winemakers in Napa. There weren't that many back then. My dad would show me vines and say, well, this is, what a Chardonnay leaf looks like compared to a Cabernet.
We were talking about Gergich Estates, and I said you were as a child. And that was one of the questions I was going to ask. Were you? And I meet a lot of winemakers and proprietors who did not intend to follow in their parents' footsteps. I had not, and or I was a pharmacist. So, was that something that you knew was happening as you were growing up?
Well, being an only child, my father made it very clear that I was going to be a winemaker and follow in his footsteps. And being the proper stubborn Croatian with the stubborn Croatian genes, I would always say no. Now, I grew up literally next to him, absorbing all this information, spending all of this time at, most of the wineries from Montelena, a little bit at Robert Mondavi, and then of course at Gergich Hills. But I always I had so many interests, besides music. I enjoyed writing and literature and so many different kinds of science that it'd be hard for me to go, to figure out what to go in. I actually ended up going to UC Davis because that's the only college application my dad would sign. And I ended up taking music and Latin. So while I was there, of course, I to me, I used to read science textbooks for fun. And so the idea of having to go and study for something that I'd already been doing and instinctively knew how to do just didn't make as much sense, where I felt like I needed I needed to study music with other musicians, with people that could really move me forward in that direction. And so I also ended up getting a graduate degree in harpsichord performance. And
Of
my
course.
father kept being worried that I would never come home. And, but I did. And I think the more, because I started in the cellar, I started on the bottling line. I worked in the cellar. I worked in the laboratory for a long time. I love that because then I didn't need to, communicate with people. I could just be by myself and analyze wines. And then worked in the tasting room, worked in sales admin and accounting. And when I finally started going out learning how to sell, that was the worst thing for me because my father was such an amazing speaker. I literally grew up going to vintner dinners from the time I was a small child. And when he opened his mouth to speak, people's jaws dropped. And so I grew up with this, and being the horribly painful introvert that I was, I'm like, I'm never going to be able to do that. Oh, God forbid. But he forced me to do it and kept forcing me. And it was amazing. At one point, I finally got over this terror that I had of speaking in public and became comfortable with it.
I was going to say
Mhm.
that you would not guess in any remote fashion that you have a problem with public speaking and or camera, no less.
Mhm.
So
Well,
congratulations on getting over that.
well, you know what? I used to, I was a little upset at my dad for making me do that thing that was so painful to me. But I have never ceased to thank him for that opportunity to, learn and grow and do something that I never would have done on my own.
Great
So,
lessons
yeah, it's
that
amazing.
that are simple but important. And so, it sounds to me that regardless of your opposition and your teenage resistance, that you were going to be in the wine business. That was just it was going to end up that way.
That is absolutely true. So I do happen to love wine. I think a lot of it was the fact that my dad was so accomplished and so talented at what he did that, reaching his level or even, surpassing it was just unimaginable to me. So,
Well, 77, I mean, look, in any business environment, to run 43 years already is phenomenal in any case, and particularly in something as volatile as which is really an agricultural business. Wine is it ebbs and flows with agriculture and crops and consumer needs. Um, I had this conversation with Mike Salacci too a little bit, and we're talking about the cost of Napa land, and like if somebody's, let's just take the typical scenario these days. I'm a government contractor, and I used to make freeways, and now I've got so much money I don't know what to do with it, so I build a winery, and that's sarcastic, of course, or as a surgeon, and now I get in the wine business. So enamored with this idea, and I build this huge thing, and I can't make any money because I've spent who knows on the land and then the structure, and I'm forced to sell these wines at hundreds of dollars a bottle just to get my costs back. And who's buying them right now? So in today's environment, what is Napa like? How do you feel it's changed? And I don't mean this in a bad way. It's more commercial than it was. It's a great tourist destination, and I think it's fabulous for people to go visit and learn the wine trade, or at least get exposed to it. But from an operations standpoint, how has this changed since 1977?
It's huge. I don't know how people can afford to get in the business these days with land costing, at least $500,000 an acre. We, we are so lucky that my father had the wisdom to actually purchase land a long time ago. Even, our property in Yountville, it's 75 acres plus a beautiful Victorian mansion. We have the second oldest, but the largest old Cabernet vineyard in Napa Valley, which was planted in 1959. There are 25 acres of it. When that opportunity came for him to buy it at $70,000 for the entire thing, he decided he was going to wait until the price went down.
Yeah.
Multiple times later, the price kept going up, and he was finally able to purchase it, but still nowhere near the astronomical prices that we have these days. So we were very well placed a number of years ago. We purchased that last vineyard in the 90s. And so we now have 5 vineyards, and we've been estate grown officially since 2003. Everything is certified organic. We have, for us, natural farming is the most important way of actually producing grapes of the highest quality and also preserving the longevity of the vines. When you take care of the vines, they're going to last a lot longer. So we
You
have.
chose that that was one of the questions I was talking about here. The idea of organic, biodynamic, sustainable, all these buzzwords that are going around, they mean something, of course, but do you think that that's the ultimate future of the wine industry? That, and one of the comments, let's go back a little bit. One of the comments I get a lot, particularly from indigenous winemakers from Europe, is my kids are playing in this vineyard. They're crawling around in that dirt and they're screwing around, they're touching the vine. So I don't want pesticides and things that don't belong there, yeah,
Mhm.
on them. Is that the prevailing attitude?
I don't think that's the prevailing attitude. I think, there are more and more wineries that are being owned by corporations, and they're looking out for a certain level of profitability in a certain time period. Because we are not only family owned, but family operated, we have the ability to really think about the long-term effects. And for us, short-term profitability doesn't mean anything when you think about, generations in the future losing, this amazing legacy that we've built. And so really making sure that our vineyards continue to produce, it's that important. And I guess I didn't really think about the kid thing until I had a child of my own. And when my son was a year, 2 years old, his favorite food was grapes. And I have this great picture of him in Yountville. He's standing up. He's like literally his arms like this. He's reaching for the grapes. And I just remember looking at that going, I feel completely safe having him do that because of how we farm.
That's
And the nature of, we're not just making a product and selling it. For us, this is something that is, born of the land that we own. It is the spirit of the soil. It is a very spiritual thing as well, and a product of love and a true art. And so these things are far beyond, okay, let's make a profit here and there.
this is,
That's not a sustainable way of doing your business. And I don't know that that's prevailing, but I think the people that are family owned and operated and that have learned the benefits of natural farming, I'll say natural for, there are many different words that people bandy about. Organic certification is very clear about what that is. Who knows when they say, oh, I'm sustainable, that can mean anything. For us, we weren't about certification. We were about doing this because it was the right thing to do. We didn't even think about marketing it or doing anything with it until Whole Foods said, well, we really want to see this on the label because our customers care. So for us, it's not a ways of marketing. It is really part of the whole philosophy we have of doing things as naturally as possible and as healthily as possible. You cannot make great wines without having great grapes. And the best way to do that is to have that complete control and to do it naturally and authentically, because, part of how we farm, because we farm naturally, we have natural yeast on our grapes that we ferment with. That is the most possible sense of place and authenticity that you can get in a wine. There's nothing more authentic than that. This wine is from this place and this time, and it's magical. So I remember.
Does the organic definition require natural yeast?
It doesn't. It's just something that we do. It's our what organic does not like though is any added sulfites, which is really doesn't make very much sense because they are natural.
Natural.
And biodynamic certification, which is much more stringent, which we actually went through for a period of time, allows the use of additional sulfites, without which, and in addition to that, sulfites are produced during the winemaking process. So I think this happens when, there's some people, there's a percentage of the population that's allergic to sulfites. And that's great so that they know that it's there.
Right.
But there's far more sulfites in dried fruit than there are in most wines, especially high quality wines. So when people talk about, oh, these sulfites, are they bad for me? I'm like, no, absolutely not. But it's all a matter of perspective.
We hear that a lot, and I've read many times there's no validated reaction unless it's like, I used to say, if you go to the Sizzler salad bar, you're probably ingesting more sulfites in that piece of lettuce than you've ever ingested in a bottle of wine. But you said a couple of things that are really interesting. One is I had a customer recently, and we started a natural wine series. I don't know if you've read about the Van Methode Naturale from France. It's a new certification. It requires only organic farm, not only, but it requires organic farming, dry farming, and hand-picked grapes. And the funny thing is they're testing this idea, this little insignia, for 3 years. And it took them 10 years to come up with the definition, and now they're going to test this idea for 3 years. But I had a customer complain recently, and I sent her, when we buy a wine that's organic or biodynamic, we ask the winery to fill out, just check off the boxes, dry farm, less than 25 parts per million, whatever the number is, of sulfur. And many wineries I taste are organic and or biodynamic and don't have the sticker or the certification label on the back, because they just do it like you're doing. They do it for the passion of doing it, and they want to do it right, and that's what they do. Because she complained to me. She goes, "This is not organic. I know what organic. I can buy Trader Joe's organic for $3.99, and it says organic on the back." I said, "Ma'am, I know this is organic because the winemaker told me." It was in the office here, but she complained about it. So I think it's an important movement. And when you talked about corporations, and this is the part that drives my side of the business crazy, they've created this influx of gallonage of €1 per liter wines that come in. I know the path. They come in New York, they come in New Jersey, they go up to New York, they get bottled in a billion different names, and they go out in the marketplace. They're on Groupon, 15 bottles for $45. And I have a problem with that because it completely defeats the experience that you're trying to create, that I'm trying to create, that somebody sits down with a glass of wine and feels something from that vineyard, from that winery, from that soil, from that weather, from their philosophy. And you can't do that in 20,000 gallon Tetra Tech, 20,000 liter Tetra Tech bladders at $1. I have a very good friend who was selling one of these competitive clubs of mine, $2 per liter wines, and he got beat by somebody selling $1 per liter wines. And you just said it, you can't make good wine from bad grapes. For $1 a liter, what are you going to get? Is you're going to get $1 per liter wines. And so huge companies have come in, millions of dollars from venture capitalists, because this is such an enamored romantic business. We want to be in the wine business, and they don't know how to make it, so they just do it this way. And it's making my job really hard. Tell me about the marketing of Napa wines, particularly during COVID. Restaurants are closed. What have you heard from your neighbors, and how are we going to survive this thing?
So this is, it's been a really difficult time for all of us. And some of us are more or better equipped than others. Those of us who have always sold in all avenues are doing better, because we've literally since Safeway got the idea that, wow, maybe we could have some fine wine in our store. We've been selling to them. We've been selling wherever our customers are. And those outlets are doing very well. And people are also buying wines that they know, wines that are iconic. They're not necessarily trying out new and different things. If you have set yourself up as, I'm a restaurant only wine, I'm sorry, you're in trouble. You're selling at a huge discount now to small independent shops. You're not going to be selling to the big guys because they're so busy they can't add anything. You're going to be selling to the small, saying, great discount. And now it's an opportunity for people to try things that they might not have tried before at a much better price. But it's been interesting. I mean, we shut down on March 13th, and the following Monday, we sent out our wine club shipment. We pretty much kept most of our people home except the essential ones to answer phones, send the club, and literally found that people loved us calling to ask, did you get your wine club shipment? Would you like to schedule a virtual tasting so we can talk to you? We've never done this before. We're like, we have to have some way of connecting. People loved getting the phone call from us. And in one, every year for my dad's birthday, we have a great big sale. So that's, for the month of April. We had people who would reorder cases 3 or 4 times within that time period because they were stuck at home. Right. And so, and a number of wineries have found that, online direct sales to their customers have risen considerably. Most of them have. Restaurants, that's been really very difficult, unless you're on a wine, by the glass program where they decide to feature you in a takeout, but you're still not selling as much as you ever did before. So it's just a very, very difficult situation, and we don't know when we're going to be able to get out of it. This is clearly very contagious. We're learning more about, what's safe and what's, not safe. But the fact that not everybody is adhering to the guidelines and has their personal views about what should be done has made it difficult. If we reopened, then we had to sort of, well, we didn't close back down because we were, doing completely safe social distancing with masks outside. But inside has had to close down for a while because of the number of cases going up.
Well, it's interesting because which the fact to have outside is great, but there are going to be a lot of wineries. Well, when I was up last and we stopped at the Oxbow and we had coffee with the wine journalist from the Napa Valley Register, and I think I've said this a couple of times on this podcast, I thought it was going to be an interview about me. It wasn't about me. She was asking questions like, well, how do you think Napa wineries should get through? She said something to the effect of, we're learning how to chat up here. And
Yes.
This is just before COVID. And I thought, well, if I have a robust digital presence, like here at Wine of the Month Club, if I don't chat, I probably lose 40% of my business because so much of it comes through chat and texting and those methodologies. And if there are a lot of wineries in Napa that don't do that and they relied on foot traffic, which there must be, at no disrespect to them, they just, this was a great business and we're having fun.
No.
Are we going to see more corporate takeovers then, like, Vintage Estates or, these other guys are out there buying up whatever they can buy?
It's entirely possible. I think it's going to be difficult for some to get through. It'll be easier for some others, but I think anytime that there's a crisis, there are those who are able and are in a position to take advantage of those things and actually improve their business model and succeed, and those who won't. So who knows what it will look like.
That was right on. So tell me about then, when we get out of this thing, what's the future of Gergich, varietals, volume, anything that's on the horizon that's in your plan to, I don't know whether we can change. The Gergich is so great and the name is so great, and looking forward to selling some more, because when you said that people are buying, this is what I want to get to. The COVID thing has taught us a lot in the marketing side of this, and you've seen it now. People are buying what they understand. So I've been selling brands. Not typically I don't sell brands because typically brands didn't need me to sell the wines for them. This outlet is no longer that kind of outlet. In the early days for Chateau Montelena 72 Chardonnay, yes, they need all the exposure they could get, but it's not important anymore. So people were buying things they know from me, and I never really carried them, but I'm carrying them now. I've learned that the number of contacts, and you just said it with the phone calls, is a huge thing, particularly during this COVID thing. The more you contact them, where they don't want to open the email, that's okay, but they might open the next one, and they're responding to them. And the other thing that's crazy that's happened here is my customer service rating, which has always been very high, has gotten higher. And we turned the phones off for 6 weeks. Between chat and texting and emailing, they were buying more. So our marketing, let's face it, we're here to sell stuff, as a winery, and you brought it up with the sulfur edition, a winemaker's not going to let a whole crop go to waste because it might get moldy because we didn't put sulfur on it. I mean, we're trying to make money here. We're trying to earn a living and treat people to our skills. But so it's an interesting time for Napa, an interesting time for the wine industry. On the flip side of all that, sales are up. So we're very happy about that.
And hopefully it continues. I mean, that's the thing. There's so much uncertainty. I think, what I've really enjoyed throughout my career is the kind of comments that I've gotten from people. We've been around for a long time. We're an iconic brand, but I think for a while there, people forgot what we tasted like. And so when we would go out and taste people, they're like, oh my gosh, I forgot this was so good.
Mhm.
And I think that's what's happening now as well. My favorite comment is, oh, I don't like Chardonnay, but I love yours. And I
Yeah, that's great.
all the time. So I think, and also younger people, so many wineries like, oh, how are we going to get to the millennials? How are we going to get to them? And I'm like, I look in my tasting room, at least back when I used to, and I'm like, this is full of millennials
Yeah.
drinking wine, and when you ask them, so, how did you learn about our wines? Oh my gosh, our parents introduced them to us and we love them. That's been a huge one.
That's great.
And in fact, when we opened our tasting, we opened on June 10th. I think I was there that weekend, and there was a group of young people there, outside enjoying. And I asked them, so, wow, have you had Grgich before? Like, no, we've never had your wine. So why did you come up here? Like, we were looking for just a place to get away from San Francisco that had a beautiful outdoor space. And we're here and we love the space and we love your wines. And
Wow.
wow, this is great. So I think some of it is just opportunity and making sure that you have the opportunity, and that the opportunity is presented.
You may have just opened the safe to how to get to millennials, because everybody in this business has been trying to figure that out for 100 years, for not 100 years, for 20 years. Like, well, these millennials, they're millennials.
Uh,
I have 3 of them myself, and I don't
mhm,
understand them. So I
mhm,
don't know. I don't want to take much more of your time. Actually, I think we should wrap this up.
mhm.
I would love to do it again, maybe in person next time. We didn't even really scratch the surface on some of the Judgment of Paris, but I really wanted to hear about your career and the path of the company, and so many things happening to us right now in this industry that I wanted to get your take on that. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I hope we get up to see you. And we're
Thank you. I hope so too.
bringing
Mhm.
some. This is going to go out with an offer on some Gergich wines through the Cab and the Rosé and the Chard and all the wines that you're carrying. And I'll get with Michelle on that. So be safe, and thank you so much for the time. And if you get a chance to convey to your father, thank him for, I told George Tabor, I said, thank you for this job.
Mhm.
Because, before you get off, George says, I think maybe it would have taken 5 to 10 years for California wine to get its traction. I'm like, but not like this. There's
Mhm.
no way that this, particularly that we can tell this story today. If California wine just evolved on its own, and we sent some to France and people figured it out, and we started to drink wine here. And I think Lyndon Johnson was the first president to serve domestic wine in the state dinner. You know, that was 1950, 62 or something. Okay, so
Mhm.
this is long before the Judgment of Paris, and it was at the White House, but no one cared. No one cared then. And
Mhm.
so I thanked him for this job, and I thank your father for this job, because it's been very rewarding for me.
Mhm.
And I hope we get to see you soon.
Thank you, Paul. And actually, my father has often told me that the thing that he is most proud of is not the 73 Montelena or the 69 Mondavi Cabernet, but of actually providing employment to almost 50 people and their families.
Well,
So that's something that has been very consistent. And in fact, the gentleman that worked for us for a very long time, Gustavo Brambilla, started his own wine. Also figured in the movie, he was actually hired after the Judgment of Paris. Um,
really,
but it was a great story with him as well. I know you're trying to wrap up, but his father worked at Beaulieu Vineyards, I believe, as a janitor.
Mhm.
And my dad would see him and all of his children, and he took him aside one day and says, the best gift you can give your kids is education. And if you take at least one of your children and send them to school, so that they can learn winemaking, that would be wonderful. And so he sent his son Gustavo, who showed up on, Chateau Montelena's doorstep and asked my dad for a job. And
Wow.
so he left Montelena and came to work for my dad for many years before going out on his own. So, again, education, and that goes hand in hand with employment, and it's something to be very proud of. So, thank you, Paul. It's
Thank
been
you. It's been a
wonderful.
wonderful life lessons, and your father is very wise, and he's created a lot more than 50 jobs.
Yes, he has. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.